The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tyler, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time watch-along podcast. When did this happen? This week, we are going to be discussing episodes 3 and 4 of Amazon's The Wheel of Time television show. As always, we are joined by Greg, and we are also joined by a special guest this week. So I'm going to toss to Greg to do all of the introductions beyond what I have done so far.
Hello. Good to hear you, Tyler. Good to have a guest with us tonight. A red letter day in the history of Through the Glass Columns because we have our first ever guest on the show, by which we make the accidental mistake of taking away one of our two listeners who will now skip this episode and not give us our download count. So as Tyler said, we are on episodes 3 and 4 of the television show. I will issue our spoiler warning and say we will do our best to stick only to the events of the show. So if you are a fan of our show, our regular show, you may know that we know more than we're letting on, but we're trying to be sensitive to people who might just tune in for the television show coverage, not the book coverage. But if that's you, we recommend you go back and find our back catalog and join us to discuss these books and read, because it is a quite different experience. So having now issued that challenge, I will introduce our wonderful guest, who is, of course, Ben Brophy, of frequent reference on this podcast, but never actually on. Ben, how are you tonight?
I am doing great. Long-time listener, first-time caller. Very excited to be here.
That's a reference to the radio, which some of our younger viewers may not know exists.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they read books, I guess. I don't know. Maybe not for this. Yeah, I rewatched the 2 episodes that we're going to talk about today. I'm very excited. I think it's really cool how this show is keeping to all of the themes and then changing things in ways that I find kind of surprising and interesting and cool. So I think it's kind of appropriate because it's like another turning of the wheel, right? It's like the same characters, but things happen slightly differently. So I'm really into it. And I'm excited to talk about it.
Awesome. So since you're thinking about like what are the differences and similarities and some of these things, I'm curious, now that we've seen half of a season of the show, you are someone like Greg who is new to the series. You've been reading along with the podcast. So what has been maybe your favorite change or most interesting thing you've liked about the show that you didn't get from the books? And is there anything that you haven't liked in the adaptation? And then Greg, you can follow up with answers to the same questions, because game show format works well when there's too many speakers.
I've really liked some of the new depth for characters like Nynaeve. Like, I think Nynaeve is really bigger force and more interesting in this show than she was in the first book, at least. And so I'm pretty into that. I mean, she has a big moment at the end of these episodes. But that's probably the part I'm kind of most excited about. I think it's interesting and okay because they have to do it, that they've just dropped a whole lot of things, right? There's a bunch of stuff that were kind of big moments in the book for me that I remembered that are just not there anymore, including like what's his name, Ross Domon,
Bail Domon.
Yeah,
Bail Domon, right? Like Bail Domon, they just seem to totally skip him, which is fair, but I was just like, that's a character who I totally like pictured who the actor was and everything. I was imagining what it's going to be like, and it's just not there.
Yeah, they went full Tom Bombadil on a couple of characters.
So sorry, I'm getting over my emotional baggage. I was all excited to not be the one who knew less this show, and then Ben revealed that he prepared and just has a better memory than me. So I'm cooked. I'm still gonna be at the bottom of the totem pole. Yeah, thinking since I've already shared my thoughts on the show on those first two, I'll just note that I think to Ben's point, there was some bigger stuff kind of skipped now, and it felt very different than this segment of the book, and so that's intriguing to me. I completely agree, you have to make some choices and some decisions, and my rule for adaptation, or at least the one I give lip service to, is always just, yeah, as long as you respect what the book was about, what its themes were, then I don't mind if you make those changes to adapt it to a new medium. And but I think that's going to be tested, and I have to make sure I actually believe that as we go on. Now, Tyler, this is your 47th time through these episodes. Are you still discovering new stuff? Do you find yourself rewarded by those rewatches, or is it just, oh, yep, these are the greatest hits at this point?
I think it's a little bit of both. What I find is that the kind of character drama moments, kind of the character interactions that I found really new and interesting the first time I watched the show, they just kind of stay there, right? I'm the kind of person, don't get me wrong, I rewatch the OC every few years. I love me some teenage drama, but I don't necessarily need to do it over and over and over again. I'm kind of, after the couple, 2 or 3 times through, I'm pretty content with what I can get out of those conversations. But in terms of like scene building, and in particular the sets and the designing and the costumes, there are new little details that I am catching on every watch. And that's something that's really exciting to me, because part of the reason I love The Wheel of Time is because you can read 15 books over and over and enjoy it the 5th time. And so I'm really glad to see the TV show is doing, even in like very small, kind of almost Easter eggy ways, making a rewatch really valuable. And in fact, this actually brings up something that you had mentioned when we were watching the show together. We did this about a week ago. We saw something new from Nynaeve, and you immediately commented on the color that she was wearing. And that's just a new, fun, exciting kind of thing that we can do on the television show that you can't elsewhere. And I find those are the things that I really get out of the repeat viewing. Now, since we've got kind of some expansive plot going on in these couple of episodes, there's a lot going on. I think to keep all of the moving pieces in order, we should arrange things in terms of different plot lines that we discuss individually. And I suggest we do these in order from most similar to the book to least similar to the book. So let's begin, I suggest, with Perrin and Egwene, because their encounters with the Tinkers in these episodes, I think, are pretty on the nose. There's a little bit missing, but otherwise, this is a pretty faithful adaptation of what happens in the book. So I know for me personally, the Tinkers have a really kind of special place in my heart because they kind of espouse the philosophy of the Way of the Leaf. And I think that that's a really interesting thing Robert Jordan has done. And just knowing you as a person, Ben, I know you are kind of also interested in that kind of philosophical aspect of the Wheel of Time. So I'm curious what you thought about this plot line, because I find it kind of the trickiest to adapt in terms of having so much philosophy embedded in it. But then at the same time, it's also the one that they kept the most similar to what happened in the books.
Well, first I'm going to take the tone down a little bit, because I really missed the most ridiculous part of that storyline, which is all of the women being horny for Perrin and
You're right.
dances that make him blush constantly. So I left that part out. But yeah, I really love the Way of the Leaf, and I kind of found myself like jotting down some of the things that they say, like do you know the song? Yeah. And all that stuff, like so that, I don't know, just because it's like that's the kind of thing I would memorize or something. I thought, as the philosophy part that I thought really struck me was when can't remember her name, but the woman who's kind of the leader of Isla is talking to Perrin, and they're debating about violence versus nonviolence. And she's like, have you ever picked up the axe? Are you happier now than you were then? And I thought that was really cool, and made me think back to the part. I mean, he had the dream about that in the episode, but he if you think about what they would have done, what they say they would have done, he could have run away, as could have his partner.
Yeah.
And they would still be alive. And so it's interesting, but they would have left behind other people in the village. So it's like, it doesn't go with his honor code, but would he have been happier? It kind of seems like maybe he would have. So I thought that was a really cool thing just to put into the episode.
Yeah, I also found, I guess this merges what you said, Tyler, and what Ben said. I found their production design just really compelling. I think I said when we were sitting there, it's clear the tinkerers are drawing on the Romani, and I was noting that, it has such a different resonance in Europe than it does here, both as a people who were lost and then the source of a lot of, as I understand it, social upheaval across particularly England in kind of the 80s, if I am roughly correct. And so I found myself kind of questioning again, like, well, is this a deft hand from Robert Jordan that kind of remixed these elements, or is this, the blundering hand of a dumb American? And he has certainly not demonstrated himself to be a dumb American at any time. So I want to believe the former, not the latter. Yeah, we missed out on a lot of horny ladies, but we did get a manic pixie dream tinkerer in the form of a Egwene suitor, and I think that really felt very direct. I liked his casting, and I liked Isla's casting. I almost walked out of the room when I said, "Oh, that actress is from Orphan Black," and neither of you had said you'd ever seen Orphan Black, which
sorry,
you should check out at some point. It's a really kind of crazy, amazing show. For like 4 of its 6 seasons, it kind of falls off the rails. So I was excited to see that, and I do think, all 3 of us have a very soft spot in our heart for The Good Place, which somehow manages to make philosophy the plot. Whereas here it's much more of a traditional, let's balance plot and pause for philosophy. But I'm not going to go so far as to compliment The Dream, but I do think it was clear why we were having those questions with this character in a way that wasn't always clear in the book, at least to this blind, dumb reader on his first trip through.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that's really interesting to me in this episode is that there's not a whole lot of changes in Perrin and the way that he acts in, his interactions with the Tinkers, but I think the way that those actions kind of feel is very different because we have had the alteration to Perrin's plotline in the first episode, right? He is no longer getting a pitch from the Tinkers, nonviolence is good, and, there's nothing wrong in your past related to this axe. He is now getting, you accidentally killed your wife. Not having picked up the axe sure seems like a lot better of a deal when that is what's on the other side. So I'm kind of stuck here where I'm like, I don't love the fact that we created a female character to murder her exclusively to advance a male character's plot. But I kind of love what it does for Perrin in these 2 episodes. It really changes the dynamic of how he interacts with the Tinkers. So I'm curious what both of you thought about that particular dynamic or any other kind of subtle changes in this plotline.
I thought that, if we talk about things we miss, one thing I miss is that he has more wolfiness already in this point in the book. There's just more, there's the other character who's like a human who can communicate with wolves, who is in the book, who's omitted here, which makes sense. And they did a lot of that, having them being chased by the wolves. But that stuff, I guess that stuff seems like a really big part of Perrin, and that in this part of the Wheel of Time. So I missed that a little bit, I guess.
Yeah.
But I do think Perrin does have a lot more depth, as do several of the characters in this version of it.
Yeah, I have to believe that we'll be getting into the wolfiness in the next 2, and it'll just be reordered, like we didn't meet Tom until this week, which we reordered. And it's funny to me because I think back to our episodes of this section of this book, and Tyler talks so much about how the Rand chapters are just so dull. And it seems like you'd make all the cuts from that strand of this, and maybe I will see significant cuts. So it is kind of surprising that, as we've said, we've skipped a couple big steps along these paths, and makes me think a lot, probably too much. I guess, it's the television version of metagaming, where I'm like, okay, so if we're skipping these things, what are we aiming for with episode 7 and 8, and exactly how much will be covered, and trying to game backwards from that what I think each episode will be. And I often find myself, I played that a lot with Game of Thrones, and then they would delete huge sections of a book. So it wasn't ever kind of reordering or aiming at something, and especially once things got kind of loose towards the end there. But all of that aside, I will say I do feel like this is a steady hand making these choices. I'm not saying, oh, they cut my favorite thing for no reason. I'm saying, oh, they must have a reason for replacing that. And I don't know if that's from the quality of the show that we've seen so far, or just, knowing. I mean, I talked last television episode, which Ben hasn't heard, about a really cool filmmaker who's one of the head writers here. And so I just kind of trust that we're in capable hands for all those reasons. So I assume we'll get our favorite things later, or else I get to be an angry fan on the internet. And now that I know just barely more than nothing, I can go complain about it.
I think you actually might know too much to be an angry fan on the internet. Having read 2 books is usually overqualified. I think that
2 total, not 2 in the series, just two books
2 total. I don't really have too much else to say about the Egwene Perrin section of these episodes. Seeing no immediate interjection from either of the other people who are on the podcast, I then suggest we move on to what I am going to call the medium modified plot line, which is the Rand, Matt, and new to the show, Tom plot line. So we get a lot of new things introduced here, including a few ideas that aren't really in the books. So I'm going to kind of do the Uno reverse card. Greg, you've been getting the end of the conversation, not the beginning, so I'll let you respond first. What were your thoughts on the adaptation of this section of the book into the show? What differences worked for you, or similarities, or just in general, did you like this section of the show and how it was executed?
Generally positive. It's the other Amazon fantasy show that gets all the stories written about its budget, but I'm like, this was not cheap. And my beloved Obi-Wan Kenobi show aside, this was not the volume, so it looked really good, and you could tell it's real in a lot of it. I mean, I'm an okay hand at picking out some of the augmentations where they add mountains or whatever, but and maybe I'll continue with the setting to say that felt different to me. I thought of Matt and Rand as traveling through a lot of farmland and visiting very small towns, and this was clearly like, it felt like West Virginia, right? It's like, oh, a small town forgotten by the economy, and the mines not as great as it used to be, and nobody can leave this town. Is it a John Cougar Mellencamp song? Maybe, I don't know. We'll see. So it just felt kind of different at that scale. But then the core interactions between Tom, the boys, and the barkeep, who I don't recall her name.
Nope.
The barkeep.
Yeah.
Those worked. Okay, those worked for me totally, and I was really engaged. I thought she was awesome and felt fresh, even though I know there are related characters in the book. They encounter a lot of taverns and such. So, and maybe the last thing I'll say is no music from the boys, but I guess they need a flute from Tom first. I don't know, but I'll pass it to Ben. Ben, how did you feel about these sections?
Yeah, I think so. In the first book, like, there's a lot, like you said, a lot of Matt and Rand wandering through the country, and I think they did some things like Dana, the dark friend barmaid, is or bar owner, I guess, is like a mashup of several of the characters who they meet along the way. So she's the woman who traps them in the stable, and she's also the guy who locks them into a cell, and then Rand bursts through the wall. So there's like a few different things going on there, and I mean, it's good. That was a good part of the book to compress, so I'm in favor. I thought the actress was really good, and she did a good job transitioning from fun to menacing during the episode, and while also kind of being not pure evil, like a good villain. Like, she seems to have an idea that, well, that the Dark One, good things could happen as a result of her following the Dark One, both for herself and the world. Though it's quite silent, like, wouldn't it be great if we just ended the world? It's such a pain.
I mean, we've all been there, right?
Yeah.
I find, and you mentioned this earlier, Greg, when you were talking about kind of when we read the books, I get really frustrated with being stuck in Rand's head too often, right? It's a big problem for me. And I think these episodes highlight why, is because you can condense that plot line down, still get all of the exciting moments, still get all of the fun that I think comes in the end of those chapters, and just not get bogged down. You have a little more time for Egwene and Perrin, or let's say to invent an entirely new plot for some of our other characters. So I think this works really effectively. And for me, part of the reason why is what you kind of mentioned, Ben. It's the funny that then kind of ties into the eventual really, really dark, right? So I think that contrast works really well. And one really interesting example of it that I want to mention and then just kind of throw to you guys for general thoughts on this section and what you loved and what have you. My favorite part of both of these episodes in the Mat, Rand, Tom section is Tom's introduction. When we first see him get up on stage and sing a song. That song, by the way, for those of you who are book readers, is an adaptation of the prologue of the first book when we are in Lews Therin's head. So there's some really interesting, go back and listen, fun Easter eggy things going on there. And I think it's a really effective introduction to a character that we spent a decent amount of time lamenting not being in the first two episodes last week. So for me, that's my big standout moment. I thought that introduction just worked. I'm curious for both of you, what were your favorites or least favorites, if there were any, in this section? Greg, go ahead and go first.
Thank you for recognizing me. I want to like make us do Robert's rules or something. So I think my favorite scene out of that section, I did really like the tavern owner, and I liked the idea that she was stuck and saw this as her way out of there. It was the right mix of, oh, this is familiar but totally new in some other ways, which I really enjoyed. But I think my favorite scene was actually when Mat and Tom are burying the thief. I really liked that kind of character moment where these two antagonizing kind of find some mutual respect, and the idea that like, well, I'm gonna pick his pockets, and Tom's like, hey, I've been there. Like, that felt really good to me, that it deepened Tom. And then his line of, well, if you're gonna pick his pocket, the least you could do is bury him. It just all felt like true to that character, and endearing, right? Like, it's like, oh, the thief with honor, what would that be? Chaotic good?
Yeah,
sure.
that sounds right. Sure.
It just feels right and good for those characters. I don't know that this is a least favorite, but I do think we continue to feel the Game of Thrones, like, let's sex this up a little with the actually quite dirty joke of like, let's take turns chopping wood, except he thought he meant let's take turns with the barmaid. I was like, wow, that's I think it's not TV, it's HBO or it's Amazon Prime, as the case may be.
I thought that I really liked the song, and one thing I liked, The Man Who Can't Forget, right? The thing I liked about it is that you guys have talked, or Greg has talked about, he doesn't like prophecies in books a lot. I don't like when they do song lyrics in books, which they do a bunch. And because in my mind, I'm like, trying to figure out the melody for this thing while I'm reading it in my head. I have to hear it.
Yeah.
So being able to actually hear the song makes it a lot better. And I felt like, kind of like you said, they built some prophecy telling into the song as well. And watching it this way, it almost, maybe it's just the threads of the Wheel of Time, but it kind of seemed like Tom was looking right at the boys while he was singing the song, as if it was definitely like he knew it was related to them in some way. I thought that was pretty interesting. I also like the scene with the corpse. One random question I have is they seem to make a point of how that Aiel man had the crystal, and then he had this little carving of a dog, and I wondered why and what that means.
That is a very good question. I'm going to give you the answer that Robert Jordan gave every time someone asked him a question at a con when it was something that he would write about later. Read and find out. That's all I can tell you about the small stone dog that was in the Aiel's pocket. I think the one really interesting section to me, we're talking a lot about like either similarities or scenes that we, really stood out for us. The one thing that stood out to me, maybe not in a negative way, but at least in a way that made me kind of take a step back, is the ending of the sequence in the 4th episode, where we see Mat clearly sick, and then he has the black CGI, whatever it is, from Shadar Logoth. And then there's kind of a question, I think, at the end of the episode. Did the Fade kill the farmer's family, or did Mat kill the farmer's family? And that's a really dark take on Mat in a way that we don't really see in the books. So I'm curious, both of you, I think you kind of talked about, Greg, like the HBO-ification of this show. Like, how much do you see it kind of going in that darker direction? And does that work for you in a book series that we're a decent ways into and we haven't seen a whole lot of really deep dark so far?
I will say when that scene started, I believe when Rand entered the house, I was positive Mat had killed the family. That was like, my brain went there. It was no question. As that scene unfolded and he gave his reasoning, like, oh, I guess that could make some sense. So I think you're right to say it left ambiguous, but it was striking to me. This is a familiar trope where it's like infected with, and that could be controlling him or controlling his hand. But I've been thinking a lot about Indiana Jones lately, and a lot of people really object. In Temple of Doom, there's a moment where Indiana Jones smacks Short Round, right? And he's under a control. He's been brainwashed by drinking the blood of Kali. All just a little racist, and it feels bad to just repeat it. So sorry for cultures that movie is terribly insensitive to. But it was striking to me in hearing people kind of return to those movies, how many people so strongly objected to that. And then I didn't really clock that. But then when this moment happened in the show, I was like, oh, that's the exact same thing. Like, violence done against a child just feels so visceral and dark. And it's like, if you want to prove somebody is quite evil, that's the way to do it. And that in that way, it made me think that Mat is in a much more troubled, dark place than I think I had read him as at this point in this book.
I think in reading the book, this is the thing I kept thinking was going to happen. There's all this foreshadowing about darkness with Mat, and I kept thinking there's going to be some big thing like this that happens, and it never quite gels, right, with him.
Yeah.
So in a way, I think it made sense. I found I don't know if that's the right word, but I was discomforted by the family's death. That's after they perfectly took the time to get us to have a few little character moments with the family so that we would particularly feel terrible about it. But I thought it was interesting. One thing I was confused about is that Tom was confronting the Fade, and I felt like I just met Tom, and so I'm confused about what's happening there. And I was very proud of myself. I don't think this is a spoiler, but I thought that the doll's name was Brigitte, and that seemed like an Easter egg.
That is accurate. I think it is not a spoiler to say that there is a fun little Easter egg buried in the name of that doll.
Yeah.
I don't really have too much else to add about this section. I think it works really well. I think it's an interesting adaptation. Last question or last thoughts that either of you two had on this plot line before we move on to the last and certainly most novel of the plots. Greg, any last thoughts on Mat, Rand, Tom?
No, Ben raised his hand, so I was waiting for Ben.
Well, I think the one thing that I thought was interesting is that Dana, all of a sudden, surprises Rand by asking if her hair isn't enough like Egwene's,
Yeah.
and saying that she has dreams of the five of them,
Mm.
introducing being five in this story. Um, I thought that was interesting. I felt like that's just like a way to try to compress all of the conspiracy going around among the Dark Friends into a way that, you know, the Dark One speaks through her mind too. It like makes it
Yeah.
easier to kind of explain how the plot could be working and everything. But I thought that was a big change and I don't know, interesting.
It reminds me a lot of the opening of book 2, which we will leave vague at that, instead of kind of where we were understanding Dark Friends, not Dark Fiends, in book 1. Although I think when we were covering this part of book 1, I was saying Dark Fiends, and Tyler was correcting me.
Did I say Dark Fiends?
No, you're good.
No, you didn't.
I actually just wanted to bring up a really, really obscure Easter egg that is actually even more discomforting in once we kind of have the book to relate it to. You talked about how we get just a little bit of a scene with the family, the farmers that they meet that are eventually killed either by the Fade or by Mat. Those characters are actually credited in the credits as the Grinwell family. So that would be a pretty substantial change from a relatively minor set of characters, but ones that we did meet in the books that did not meet the same fate. So I think there's a lot of really interesting tweaks and changes. And as you say, I think they can have some pretty big implications as we go through this. And so if we're going to talk about little tweaks and changes in this plot line, then boy, oh boy, do I have a brand new plot line to sell you with Nynaeve and Moiraine and Lan. Lots of new things going on. And more or less all of it is created from whole cloth, right? I think one thing that you might be worried about as a book reader watching this show is if there's something new that you're seeing on screen, you might worry, oh, is this an adaptation of something from book 4? I'm worried I'm going to miss out on, the experience of getting it fresh. I'm here to tell you, as someone who has read everything there is to read, that's not the case here. This is completely new in the universe. And so I'm very curious to hear what a couple of first-time readers are thinking about it, because obviously everyone I've talked to about the adaptation are people who know the story all the way through. So I'm very curious to see what your thoughts are. And I want to start with the newest of the new, which by about 3 or 4 chapters of the third book, I believe is Ben.
Well, I think I liked that one of the first things in this plot line is Lan saying, "You think you know this world? You know nothing," which I felt like was kind of added for us, the people who might have read the books, to say like, "Yep, things are not going to go the way you think they are."
Yeah.
I thought that was a pretty cool little thing. There's things I didn't get, which I didn't get even knowing about the second book, where Morgaine says Siuan, I don't know what it is, something like that, which is making up. I don't remember what that reference was, if that's something I should know or not. But is that something I should know? I just don't know.
I think it's a name that was vaguely dropped at some point, but we'll get to it. You'll see it. There's some new interesting things that will be going on around that name.
Okay. Yeah, so I was into it, and I was really introducing the Aja early in the book, and really getting to see some things. Like for one, I never really understood the green Aja as being the warrior class, but I think it worked really well in this. Like I'd kind of seen them more like a healer class or something like that, I guess. And so I thought that worked. And the blue are framed here more specifically as spies, which I felt like we never really got as much from the book. And the red continue to be inquisitors like they are all the time.
Before you talk, Greg, I want to jump in really quickly and just say the green and the yellow in this episode, I think we get a vague reference to the yellow, but they are clarified very much in line with what is described in the book. We get it a little earlier here, but it's exactly accurate to say the green are the battle Aja, they're the warriors. But interestingly, both the blues and the reds do get kind of a minor reskin skin, if you will, here, where the blues in the book are described as primarily kind of having causes that they want to drive towards, whereas they're described as spies, possibly in a biased way by Liandrin. But also in the book, the Reds are exclusively interested in men who channel, whereas in the show, Liandrin drops a reference to the Reds basically policing channelers who are both men and women. So there are some modifications within the Aja system. Even as you say, we are just getting a bunch of information sooner here than we did before. I don't know if you had any more to follow up with that, Ben.
No, I thought they explained everything really well with the camp, and I kind of felt very natural to me. Even watching it the second time, I was very interested. I actually, in general, I found the first episode, I fast forwarded through a little bit watching it the second time, but episode 4 is one that I pretty much watched the whole thing because of so much to learn about.
So I'll jump on there and just say it also just struck me how fast we were learning about the Aes Sedai, and my memory's not perfect, but it felt like we were getting a lot from even kind of more current readings we've done at this very early stage. And so my mind naturally kind of went to, well, there's one of two reasons to do that. There's a storytelling reason, or there's essentially what I would call a marketing reason, right?
Yep.
Do they think they need this to kind of lure in an audience and keep them hooked? There's a way in which it kind of feels like Hogwarts houses or Game of Thrones families, I guess also houses, but there's a way in which that's kind of a compelling idea, and that's usually what you sell t-shirts of. Although again, we've said, where's the merch? So that's all compelling to me. One of my favorite moments from this section was actually the first when it begins with Nynaeve's escape from the Trollocs. And we were sitting watching that, and the loud noises had beckoned in Ben's teenage son, who came to the door and saw Nynaeve hiding in the pool and let out a very clear "she did" before wandering away, which just cracked me up, and I thought was such a good read on that, although it didn't end up being true. So shout out, because that kind of pithy observation only a teenager can make worked well for me there. So and then Ben covered most of what I would say stood out to me. The last thing I'll note is I thought the warders felt much more compelling in this, and it was very exciting to kind of see them around a campfire, do a little character building and understand them and hear them bouncing off each other. And that plus other elements certainly made the relationship kind of more clear, which dunderheads like me might have missed in the book.
Well, and
I feel like that.
Oh, please go ahead.
I kept thinking about what the warders made me think of it, but this this show really seems to cast like there's a real age of sexual liberation going on here. Maybe Matt and Rand are together. No worries, whatever.
Yeah.
Maybe the green Ajas. There's a reason that they have 2 warders, right?
That one's actually
funny.
book canon.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, I kind of like that seemed familiar to me from the book also. But I don't know. I thought I think it's kind of an interesting thing that they're doing. Like that they do that in some new like genre fiction, which I like, which is like, let's just make a new world where things work differently.
Yeah, and I think this was something that was really interesting for me when they announced that they were going to do an adaptation. Is to me, there's a really big challenge in adapting the Wheel of Time in the modern age, which is that it is premised on a gender binary. And so to some degree, if you are going to do modern storytelling and you want to be attracting, young people, you can't do that by being like, there are only men and women and there's nothing in between. And so I was really kind of interested to see how did they play around with some of these modern ideas, because I think it's accurate to say in the 90s, Robert Jordan was really pushing the boundaries, right? It can be read as a multiracial feminist fantasy story, but if we're talking about transgender issues, way, way, way behind the current times. So seeing those sorts of kind of small tweaks and how are we presenting sexuality, how are we presenting, gender and race issues, I find really fascinating, because I think Robert Jordan has kind of created a canvas that can adapt to those changes really well. And so it's just a matter of execution in terms of how they actually play out. Bringing the conversation back, Greg, you had talked about when Ben's son had come in the room. My favorite moment watching the episode with the two of you was the beginning of episode 4, when we are watching Logain invade Galen, and both of you were like, wait, what in the world? This was nowhere near the book. And so I think that kind of willingness to be bold with, we're not just changing little world building details, but also we're going to take you, kind of front stage to things that you didn't see, is something that works really well in this section for me, because as someone who has read the story a million times, it's something brand new on the screen, and that is so much fun for me. What was your guys' kind of favorite? I mean, favorite we've already done maybe once for one of these, but like, what stood out to you in this section? Because unlike what we were talking about with the previous two, there is no what was your favorite or least favorite change. This is just what worked or what didn't in this section.
I found that I really enjoyed Logain's promotion in the story. I think it's a pretty sketched out in the book, and the way that it was handled here made me want to, hear more about what happens to Logain in the future, right? And maybe he doesn't have much of a future. It's kind of hard to tell what his state is at the end of the spell that they cast on him, but yeah, I would love for him to have a conversation with Rand sometime, or and see what happens with that, I also thought it was interesting. So I watched it for the second time with the subtitles on, and Elucia is the one who Logain hears in his mind.
Interesting.
I didn't recognize the name Elucia or whatever, but then he said it's previous dragons who are speaking through him, and so I thought that was something new, like you're saying, just changing some of the gender stuff. Where I guess if that's a previous dragon, then one of the previous dragons was a woman.
Yeah.
After the first 2 episodes, I kind of ragged a little bit on some of the CG. I still think the Trollocs are the weakest of that. But I will say I thought the powers worked better for me this time around. Particularly I'm thinking in the cave, when it's like, we need to create these shields around him. I don't know, the kind of interdiction zone that will not let his powers be activated. And so I thought those worked really well. And Tyler, you had corrected me to be like, well, the way they describe the strands in the book, it really matches what we see. And I think I could see that being present here. And I can't even remember if I joked about this in the first television episode, but it's like in a room waving their hands in that way and just like praying that they put in the powers the right way. And I think in this case, I was like totally into the illusion. I'm like, yes, they are magic people and these are the powers. And the way they conceived to visualize the kind of control and then him pushing back and then the regaining of control, that all was really effective, and I felt myself, feeling very tense at this invisible thing being pushed back and forth.
Yeah, and I think oh, Ben, please go ahead. Sorry, having more than 2 people on a podcast is apparently hard.
Something about the way that they did the effects for the powers that the Aja have as opposed to the powers that Logain have was interesting. Was the black and white thing that we see a lot in the illustrations, which is cool, but his power did not seem to be part of him, right? Like it seemed like they didn't seem like the threads or whatever were coming from him exactly, they seem to have a mind of their own a little bit that he could influence, which I thought was, it made me wonder, made me think more of like, there's one of like some demonic force or old being or something that is more working through him, as opposed to it being something that comes from inside the way it does seem to with Diaja more. But I don't know. I thought that was just something you can get from the effects, which is cool.
Yeah, and I think my favorite thing about the effects with Logain is if you actually kind of pay really close attention, he is not actually weaving black strands of the power. He is weaving white strands of the power that after about a half a second are covered in black. And so you can almost see how he is weaving the same power as the Aes Sedai, but then the Dark One's, taint is the way it's described in the book, is kind of covering that up. And I think you're right to then say, Ben, like, what is that doing? Is it changing the way he's channeling? Is it changing what it looks like or what he can do with the power? And I think that, like you say, the visual effects really highlight that really, really well. My kind of favorite moment that I was going to highlight is the opposite of a visual effects moment. I thought Lan's prayer and kind of the backstory that we get from Nynaeve in terms of hearing the old tongue words that her parents said to her, but not knowing what they meant until Lan translated them. I found that to just be a gorgeous sequence that is very well acted and fleshes out characters in ways that we really didn't get a chance to see in the book. So, I think the action works. I love to see the Green Aja go crazy, but my favorite moments in this sequence were really the quiet ones. I think you mentioned also the warders around the campfire is just a lovely sequence as far as I'm concerned.
Well, and I don't remember the exact moment you turned and said, "See, Greg, there's a romance building here," to mock me again. And I will totally say, I think, and this is gonna just give my own prejudices, but I think the fact that I pictured Nynaeve and Lan both as so much older when we were reading these chapters, once you get like two young, hot people on screen, it's like, yes, this is building, right? And
Right.
it's kind of, it flows more naturally. And again, I will own that is a misreading, but to your point, it's that plus a good performance. It's like, yeah, there's real chemistry there and real affection kind of budding already, which I would say is important if we are really halfway through the trip from, again, this is supposing it roughly matches up with the book where like they're going to be a strong romance very quickly, we would assume. So we'll have to see.
I really loved when he translated the prayer that she says, because it seemed very meaningful as far as he's basically telling her the last things that her parents said, which seemed really certainly tugged my heartstrings. And then it also he said it's the king of Minas Tirith, and there's the whole thing about the connection between Minas Tirith and the two rivers, and it really seemed to make that more meaningful because she still says this whole prayer. She doesn't know what it means, but it does actually connect all the way back to the history of Minas Tirith that she doesn't know about. I just thought that was really well done and good way to tell a lot of story in just a little scene.
Yeah, and this is something that I've loved about the show is that it isn't kind of afraid to do deep world building. Sometimes I watched Game of Thrones and they would just kind of yada, yada, yada all of my favorite parts to get to the violence and the sex and the things that HBO cared about. I love that this show has given time for like, let's wander around Shadar Logoth. Let's sing a song about Manetheren. Let's translate the last words of Queen Eldrine. And I think that is what makes shows like this work. And if you lose it, it kind of feels a little more lifeless. I'm going to drop a Rings of Power reference and let you infer whatever you will about it. But I think this is just really effective from this show. I guess we're in the last thoughts on this plot line, other things that you loved, other things that worked. This to me is kind of the core of these episodes, interestingly, because it's the new stuff.
Well, I really like what you just said, so I'm going to react more to that than give my last thoughts. But one of the things I don't have a real deep knowledge of Benioff and Weiss, the Game of Thrones adapters, but it never felt like they loved fantasy. It was like, we needed a thing, we found a thing, we're gonna do this thing. Whereas the crafting of this show really feels to me like these are people who enjoy fantasy and understand what fans of fantasy like about fantasy. And again, I don't read any fantasy. I've never read any. But if I were to read fantasy, what I would love about them is the worlds they build. And I think that's so meaningful to so many of us. If I think of the Kingkiller Chronicles, I just think about the history of that school and how deep things are. And if I think of Lord of the Rings, I think about the different ages and how you'd never want to read the Silmarillion or adapt it into a Rings of Power TV show. But, it's important that it all exists and it's somewhere in the mix there. So I do think they found a much better balance. And I look forward to seeing more of that. And this is flashing back to the first episode. They gave us this tantalizing image of kind of skyscrapers covered in moss and overgrown. And it's like, these are things that I don't have an understanding of from any of my experience with this mythology, but I'm really looking forward to seeing where it develops in these hands.
If there's one thing that I really love, this one little moment, it is when Lan says, "You always get emotional when I drink," to Moiraine.
Oh yeah.
And it kind of made it more the connection between the warder and the Aes Sedai more kind of clear. I really just thought that was a really nice little touch.
Yeah, I love that scene because that scene ends with what is like the perfect 1980s John Hughes like kiss framing, and then the characters deliberately turn away from it. They do that like 2 or 3 times with those two characters, and every time it just works wonderfully to highlight how close they are, but then also that they don't have the relationship we would kind of expect from two people who are that kind of intimately close. I think the show has really handled that relationship really effectively. And I think as we kind of get towards the end of this, I know Greg is cheating on me with another podcast tonight, so he needs to get going to record that, I guess. I'm kind of curious where people are at kind of at the halfway point of this show, because we are exactly 1/2 of the way through. Interestingly, we are 3/4 of the way before COVID created all sorts of problems for this show. We will talk about that in the next 2 episodes. But I think this is very much a good place to kind of take stock and say, we've seen all of the setup from the first book at this point, not a whole lot of kind of the epic action or climax that you get towards the end. But how are you two feeling about kind of how this show has executed the establishing half of the book? Do you think it's a good adaptation so far? Is it leaving you lacking? I guess I'm just saying overall impressions, because we need to fill 5 minutes and make Greg feel like he might be late for his podcast.
So I think I'd say I have not watched the other episodes because I want to kind of stay true to the theme here. I am very happy if it continues to stray from being an adaptation. I think what's happened so far is it set up this world that I'm familiar with and then started changing it. And if it keeps changing and changing, then I am completely on board with that.
One of the things I was thinking about, and I guess this will be a deep tease for our next guest, is how do people who haven't read the books feel about this show? And how much are they engaged with it? Because to Ben's point, I think I am greatly enjoying what I'm seeing from the books and what they're changing from the books, and just kind of playing that game in my head of how this is constructed. And I'm really curious how this is working. When all the studios went on their mad scramble for IP, it really made sense that somebody would grab Wheel of Time, hugely popular, tons of source material, really fully realized world. And so it kind of made no surprise to me that they would grab that, especially in the wake of Game of Thrones. But also, like, have they made it accessible? Is it as enjoyable if you're just kind of somebody who doesn't read the books or are coming to this fresh? And I suppose some of our listeners could fill me in on their thoughts on that, which I'd love to hear, although we're recording these a little early. But please let us know how you're feeling about that. But it feels to me like a bit of a hard sell, and not that it's overly complex, but just that there's a lot of it. And so I would totally sympathize with somebody saying I found this very overwhelming. But at the same time, maybe that's overthinking it. There was a giant battle in this episode, the last episode. That's just fun, like no matter where you're at, and it looks good on a TV budget even. So maybe that's enough for those novices.
Yeah, I will say I've spoken to a good number of people who know nothing about the Wheel of Time and picked this
You
up
have?
because
You don't talk to anybody.
most of them were my students. I was being paid to interact with them. That is true. Um, but I think a lot of them didn't really see this as an IP that they were familiar with. They just saw it as like Amazon has a big new fantasy show. HBO, or I'm sorry, not HBO. Game of Thrones was good. Let's just try this out. And my experience has been a lot of them were interested. A lot of my friends were like, yeah, I know you liked this. I really enjoyed the show. A lot of them, their response was, it seems like they must have cut a lot. I think this show is doing such a good job of conveying just how big and how deep the world is that a lot of the people I know who have seen it without doing any reading, they're like, they just must have left a lot on the table. It feels kind of fully realized, even to someone who hasn't read, which makes my nerd heart really happy. That's what I want from a television adaptation of one of my favorite series. So we're getting towards the end of the episode at this point. I think we've covered all of our kind of like big picture ideas. I just want to thank everyone who has come along for the ride with us. And in particular, thank Ben for joining us today and for listening to us. Like Greg said, you are one of the people who we can bounce ideas off of and know that someone is listening. And that's a very valuable thing to have. So Ben, I just want to let you have an opportunity to say hello to the people. And if you've got anything you want to plug or say, good news to, please do.
I just want to say that as it was, so shall it be if we but remember, seek, and find, Tyler. I don't have any other social media I need to plug.
Plugging philosophy is a win as far as I'm concerned. Next week on Through the Glass Columns special Amazon edition, we will be watching episodes 5 and 6. Greg just gave me a look when I said special Amazon edition. That was fantastic. And we will, as was just hinted at, we will actually be having another guest joining us next week. It is a good friend of ours. If you are familiar with the Wampa's Lair, it is one of them. And he is actually someone who has not read the book at all. So if that is you and you are listening along for television show insights, get ready to not hear a bunch of what's the same or different from the book, but some actual kind of news about how someone other than me or Greg, or someone who hasn't listened to us talk about these books for a year, thinks about the series. Greg, feel free to take us out of this episode because I am now rambling far too much.
Another fantastic ride, concentrating on the visual interpretation of Game of Thrones, no matter what company happens to run this. If you, like me, have great guilt promoting Amazon products, please buy your books at a local independent bookstore and clear your conscience. So I will also add my thanks and gratitude to Ben, and he is too polite. So I will plug, you should check out his TeePublic store, Gonk Squadron, Gonk Squadron, where he designs Star Wars adjacent, legally clearable images, puts them on whatever product you would like, and donates all his profits to charity. And if that's not the kind of guy you want on your podcast, I don't know who is. And with that said, I'm off to go do another podcast. I will plug those at a later date, but I have lots of room on my dance card, and I hope that doesn't mean the quality of our main show here is dipping at all. So we will see you next time through the glass columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tyler Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.